Now, I tell the story because I have some questions that I'd like to ask you. Do you think that life is a random walk, or is there a thread of meaning and synchronicity woven through it? And if so, because I believe it is meaningful, if so, how do we tap into that meaning? How do we each find our particular place in that meaningful existence that we have running through us? How do we find that? And I'd like to share part of my story with you to touch on that a little bit. Imagine, if you will, a 4-year-old boy lying in a hospital bed, scared. He had terrible headaches and a stiff neck. And his doctor came to his house back in the days of house calls with doctors. They don't do that too much anymore. And diagnosed the boy as having spinal meningitis. So he was whisked off to the hospital and put in a room in isolation because of the infectious nature of spinal meningitis. And the boy's parents, my parents, could only see him through a glass window in the courtyard. That little boy was scared, looked out through the window to see his parents. When the minister from the church came, because the boy sang in the church choir, when the minister from the church came, he stood at the door, and it was quite a big room. He stood at the door and he said hello. And when the doctors and nurses came, they had their faces covered with masks. The little boy was scared. He didn't realize that 2 of his Sunday school mates were fighting for their lives in a hospital equivalent to Starship. It was called Sick Children's Hospital in Toronto, a long way from home. This boy was in a hospital in Niagara Falls where he was born, so at least he had loved ones near him, even if they couldn't come in the room. He got better. Now fast forward 24 years. That boy is now a tall young man, a little bigger than he is today, and he's on a bus camping trip through Scandinavia on his way to the Soviet Union, back when there was a Soviet Union. This was in 1986. And he's on a bus on a road cut through ice that's higher than the bus in Norway, above a fjord. This probably was in May. It was in May. And they still had snow at that time. And he called out, "I'm going to die." And he had no idea where those words came from. And all of a sudden his head started to pound, and it felt like his head was swelling up. And he said to his friends, "Is my head swollen?" They said, "No, you look fine." And it was a bus camping trip, but that night, for the first time in the trip, I think we were 2 weeks into it, fortunately, we weren't camping in tents. They had a sort of a lodge with little cabins. And I couldn't eat that night. I vomited all night, on and off, came back to bed. Didn't put together that I might have the same thing I had when I was 4. Got up in the morning and I was in such pain that I couldn't even bend down to put my shoes back on. A couple mates put my shoes on. I got on the bus and I went into a coma. And the next thing I know, very next thing I knew, I wake up from the coma. And I'm lying. Turns out I was in an ambulance, but I didn't know that. I was lying down and there was a big needle right in front of my eyes. And there were 2 nurses here. There was a doctor holding the needle. I say it was a big needle. I'm not sure it seemed like it when you're lying down there. And there were a couple of friends from my trip here. And the friend said to me, one of the friends said, "Oh, John, you're awake. Are you allergic to penicillin?" I said, "Yes." And I went back into the coma. 27 hours later, the next day, I woke up in a hospital in a little town called Molde in Norway. And I remembered what had happened. And I thought, why did I wake up just at that time? Why did I wake up at the exact moment to tell them that I was allergic to penicillin, because that's what I would have been injected with, and I would have died? And it turns out that if you have meningitis for that length of time, it was about 27 hours again, I had spots on my arms, and you have about a 70% chance of dying. I didn't, obviously. I'm standing here talking to you today. It took me 2 weeks to get out of that hospital, and I really wanted to go home. It wasn't really a fun place to be. Nobody came in the room. It was a little bit like deja vu. One nurse came in. I don't know why. She must have had some immunity to it. Nobody else came in. The doctor would come in a little bit. It was not a really fun place to be, but I did recover. But when I did, I resumed the trip that I'd started. I didn't go to the Soviet Union. That was finished. My friends all had to have penicillin injections, and they carried on their trip. But I carried on a trip that I was going to do, an around-the-world journey. And I had a 6-month leave of absence from the telephone company that I'd worked for. And my original plans were to go and see this and see that. The sort of thing that I think a lot of us do. But after that experience, I had a different idea. I had another kind of mission, I think. I woke up from that and I wasn't the same person I'd been before. I had another reason for traveling. I had questions that I think everybody has at least once in their lives, maybe many times. Questions like, one of them was, well, what woke me up at that exact moment? Who am I? Where do I come from? Where am I going? What am I here to do? Those were the kind of questions that I had. So when I resumed my travels, after I'd gone back and to my parents in Canada and got better, when I resumed my travels, I was on a different kind of journey. And it was quite a journey. I had a near-death experience through going over a waterfall in a canoe. I went across the Nullarbor Desert in Australia, hitchhiking, after the policeman said you shouldn't do that. It was